Welcome back to another episode of Gaming Origins, the series where we look at the origins and history of various topics in gaming. Today we're taking a look at another big series from Naughty Dog, a series most of you will no doubt be familiar with, Uncharted, which has spawned many games over the last 10 years. The Uncharted series is a PlayStation exclusive and is developed by Naughty Dog, who in turn are owned by Sony. Prior to working on Uncharted, they also developed Crash Bandicoot and Jak and Daxter. For more on those two series, be sure to check out the previous episodes of Gaming Origins where I look at those two in depth. The links are in the description down below. Naughty Dog began working on Uncharted after Jak 3 under the codename Big. The team opted to work on a new IP as opposed to continuing the Jak and Daxter series because they wanted a franchise that would take advantage of the new hardware, which at the time was the PS3, and thus wanted to create a game that would be more realistic, whereas in the past they created more cartoon style games. The inspiration for the series was films like Indiana Jones, National Treasure, and of course games like Tomb Raider. The game was unveiled during E3 2006, showing platforming, cover elements and third-person shooting. The game was dubbed by fans as Dude Raider because of the obvious comparisons to Tomb Raider. The version of the game we saw in 2006 was distinctly, and not surprisingly, less pretty than the final build. Textures were far more basic, and graphically the game wasn't nearly as impressive as it would end up being. Nate sported different clothes than the final build of the game, and Elena also had brown hair as opposed to the blonde hair we all know her for. Uncharted Drake's Fortune was released almost 10 years ago at the end of 2007 on the PS3. The story followed Nathan Drake, a treasure hunter and adrenaline junkie who at the beginning of the game uncovers the coffin of Sir Francis Drake, a distant relative of Nate's, containing a diary of his with clues to El Dorado, the city of gold, and therefore leading Nate on an adventure to find it with friend Sully and a journalist he conveniently bumps into multiple times during the game, Elena Fisher. Ultimately, the game by today's standard is seen as a little dated, especially in comparison to later games in the series. You fight wave after wave of enemies, the platforming wasn't perfect, and the animations were a bit awkward, but despite all this, it's still a good game given its age, and was extremely good in 2007, one of the most graphically impressive games at the time. The game scored an extremely positive score of 88% on Metacritic. 2 years later, at the end of 2009, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves released on the PS3. Uncharted 2 was a massive jump for the series in every way, and a fan favourite for many, arguably the game that really made the series take off. Uncharted 2 was one of the best looking games of 2009, and a pretty large step up from the first game, which was already pretty good looking. Animation, platforming and shooting all saw significant improvements, fixing many of the gripes in Drake's Fortune, not to mention the set pieces were also bigger and more outrageous than ever. Uncharted 2 introduced multiplayer to the series, which is since featured in all console releases, proving to be a popular mode and a welcomed addition. The story naturally follows on from the first. Nate meets an old friend Harry Flynn and his girlfriend Chloe Fraser, and wants Nate's help to steal an artifact that was owned by Marco Polo that holds the key to something. Long story short, Nate is backstabbed by Harry and ends up in jail for 3 months, before being bussed out by Sully and Elena, and that's where the story really takes off. Uncharted 2 scored a massive 96% on Metacritic, and often referred to as a masterpiece by fans and critics. Next is Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception, the game that was originally intended to close the trilogy and be the end of Nate's story. Drake's Deception released at the end of 2011 on the PS3. Uncharted 3 split fans a little, as many felt it didn't quite reach the heights of 2, taking a while to really get started, whereas others thought it was a better game. One of the prominent locations of the game was a desert. Creative director Amy Hennig said this was because she wanted to push the team creatively and technologically, as sand, water and fire are technically difficult to render with animation. Uncharted 3 included new gameplay elements such as an advanced melee combat system, allowing Nate to face multiple enemies at once. Nate is able to take on enemies using items and the environment around him, such as picking up a bottle and using it as a weapon, or pulling the grenade pin on a foe for example. The story this time around delves a little more into Nate's past, with a small portion of the game having you play as 15-year-old Nate, detailing how his relationship with Sully began. Uncharted 3 didn't score quite as highly as 2, however still garnered an incredible score of 92% overall. Releasing only a few months after Uncharted 3 was Uncharted Golden Abyss at the beginning of 2012 for the newly released PlayStation Vita. Golden Abyss was a game that was designed to show off how graphically powerful the Vita was and show how the Vita could handle console-like experiences, and there was no better series than Uncharted to show that. Unlike every other game in this video, Golden Abyss wasn't developed by Naughty Dog but Sony Bend Studio, the same devs who are currently developing Days Gone for the PS4. Being a flagship title for the Vita had plenty of control gimmicks, such as using the touchscreen and back touch pad. They worked but weren't really a good substitute for the usual controls, at least in my opinion. Golden Abyss didn't quite live up to the standards of the other games in the series, but did do a good job of taking a console series and placing it on a handheld. The game garnered pretty positive review scores overall with 80% on Metacritic. 2015 brought Uncharted: The Nathan Drake Collection, which contained the first 3 games remastered to the PS4. The first time the series had graced the console, however the release was absent of the Vita game, Golden Abyss. So what did this remaster collection improve? All 3 games now run at a solid 60 frames per second, as well as a 1080p resolution. Better lighting, textures and models across all 3 games, with the first game receiving probably the most improvement, really improving Nate's model up to par with the other games. New difficulties were added in the form of Explorer and Brutal, the first being a very easy difficulty and the latter being extremely difficult. Photo mode was another rather notable addition that didn't exist in the previous games. The remaster was received well and a good way to tie over fans till Uncharted 4, which had been delayed. The collection scored 86%, praised for how well improved the already great games. Next is Uncharted 4 A Thieves End, the latest release in the series and the conclusion to Nate's story. Uncharted 4 eventually released in the middle of 2016 for the PS4, however had a number of delays and was originally teased back in 2013. Uncharted 4 had a somewhat troubled development. Amy Hennig, the series writer and creative director, as well as Justin Richmond, the game director, both left the studio, and thus game directors for The Last of Us, Neil and Bruce, took over. This big change was set about some pretty heavy plot changes to the game. We can see this as the original teaser trailer from 2013 I mentioned before suggested a much different role for Nate's brother as possibly the villain instead of the ally he ended up as. Uncharted 4 was one of the most visually stunning games of the year and one of the best looking games I've ever seen, especially if played on a PS4 Pro with a 4K TV and HDR. Interestingly, most of the characters went through design changes, giving them much more of a realistic and relatable look, no doubt thanks to the additional power of the PS4. Maps in the game are significantly larger, with areas being up to 10 times larger than previous games. Additionally, enemy and friendly AI are improved, responding much better to Nate's actions. The story depicts a middle-aged Nathan Drake who is struggling with having to live a normal life and no longer in the midst of adventure. The introduction of Nate's brother Sam, as said earlier, ropes him back into the treasure hunting game, which causes conflict with his now wife Elena Fisher. The game scored 93% on Metacritic, praised for its graphical prowess and storytelling. Finally leading us up to 2017 is Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, effectively standalone DLC to Uncharted 4. The Lost Legacy releases this year on August 22nd and exclusively follows the story of Chloe Fraser from 2 and 3 and Nadine Ross from 4. Naughty Dog has stated The Lost Legacy will have a different feel from previous games and will also feature wider, more open environments, something that Uncharted 4 played around with a little. The plot has Chloe enlist the aid of Nadine in order to recover a fabled ancient Indian artifact, along the way trying to stop the antagonist Azav trying to get it first. The game will be graphically stunning just as much as 4, if not more, and should definitely be worth the wait. It's also worth noting the game isn't full price, you can buy it standalone for around £25 to £30 or $40 in US. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did like the video, be sure to leave a like and sub, as well as follow Project Gamer on Twitter for channel updates. Click the link on the left for the last episode of Gaming Origins on Crash Bandicoot, and one on the right for the other Naughty Dog series, Jak and Daxter. Thanks for watching as usual, and I'll see you on the next video.